Hello, everyone, and welcome to Timber Talks. We have another special episode where we interview a key player in the timber industry here in Ontario. Just to tell you a little bit about ourselves, my name is Tim Buehler. I'm one of the technical managers for the Woodworks Program with the Canadian Wood Council, and we represent the Canadian wood products industry through National Federation of Associations. We're Canada's voice for the wood products industry, with our mission being to expand market access and increase the demand for Canadian wood products through excellence in codes, standards, regulation, and education. The Woodworks program was designed as our market development program to increase the awareness of wood construction throughout the country, and we operate in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, Bois, and the Atlantic regions. And part of our mission is to offer project support. We do that through one-on-one technical interactions. We have a help desk and tech call option available where you can answer your engineering questions. We offer education and inspirational presentations to stakeholders in the industry. We also produce a number of technical resources, such as the ever-popular Wood Design Manual, specific case studies, reference guides, and technical guides where we get into specific typologies of wood construction. But today I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Mark Gaglione, the Director of Construction Sciences for EllisDon. Mark has been active in the industry for many years and has spent a lot of time getting up to speed with how mass timber works, and he's gonna impart a little bit of that knowledge on us today. So welcome, Mark, and thanks for taking the time to be here today. I was hoping you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your interest in wood construction and how that all got started.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tim. And thanks for hosting things like this. I'm not sure if you actually know, but Woodworks was my first call when I got into the timber world, when we were asked to figure out, what's going on with mass timber. Yeah, I picked up the phone and phoned one of your colleagues, and they kind of opened up the Rolodex and led me to kind of where I am today. That was all the start. So yeah, Woodworks, always happy to interface, and a great organization to help promote this stuff. So yeah, I can certainly tell you a little bit about myself and where I was, where I'm going, and what I'm doing these days. And this is the only time I have a couple of small slides, but I always like to show this one because I'm proud of this snow fort, and there's a couple funny stories that go along with it. But I've always kind of enjoyed building stuff. Even when I was younger, this was like elementary school, I was always a builder. The material of choice back then was snow, pretty much, and then it kind of graduated into connects and things like that. That, like many people in engineering school, that kind of led them into the maths and sciences, eventually more kind of technical roles. And shortly after school, a couple of years later, I ended up finding myself in EllisDon. And so like the material of choice in the industry now is like usually concrete and steel, and I find myself working on jobs that are like way larger scale, mainly out of concrete and steel again. And I've been here for maybe 7 or 8 years now. And the interesting thing is, because it's a large organization, it supports a lot of teams that are outside of the core operations. And as you mentioned, like the team that I'm on and the team that we lead is called Construction Sciences, which is like the R&D team of the company. And that's pretty exciting. I'll stop sharing now, actually. It's pretty exciting for us because we have access to a lot of big jobs and across the country. And, my entrance into wood was from this team. I traditionally kind of came from a more of a building science background. I focused in on, development of condos, air barrier transitions, things of that nature. And then it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago now that things started to change in the Canadian construction industry, and which would make timber a bit more viable to the larger scale developers. And that's when some of those changes happened and turned our executive heads, and they said, well, maybe there's something we should figure out. Let's go to our R&D team and ask them if they know anything. And we didn't. And so we just started digging, and that's when, we made contact with Woodworks initially, and, I've spent the better half of a decade now kind of researching, digging into supply chain, figuring it out. And we can certainly talk about a bunch of the work we're now executing on today.
Excellent. And I mean, you talk about the last 4 or 5 years, but EllisDon and yourself are no stranger to mass timber. I think it was maybe classified a little bit differently 10 or so years ago in that heavy timber or glulam type projects. But I think that's what a lot of people don't realize when we're talking about mass timber and it being so new, quote unquote, that it's actually been around a lot longer than people think. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to probably do this a few times. Like, yeah, you're exactly right. I memean, it's kind of like one of those like what's old is new again situations where it's been around for like 100 years. There's a lot of buildings downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver that are 4, 5, 6, even a couple little higher ones that are made of timber, like massive timber elements. I think what is, even before I started EllisDon, this was kind of the portfolio of work that we had on our plate already over the last 15, 20 years. And I think the thing that's important to realize is, like mass timber is certainly not new. Glulam has been around for decades, and the portfolio work, this is just a snapshot. There's probably 5 or 6 other large scale jobs that, included glulam atriums, nice glulam kind of roof structures, CLT decks over pools, things like that all over the country, coast to coast, and certainly around the world. The thing that is new is that, it's now no longer taking this kind of boutique form. The boutique was kind of the domain of mass timber. It was always the showpiece of the building for the most part, in these super large buildings. And now what's happening, the thing that we're seeing change is that timber is just being considered a viable alternative for not just the boutique atrium, the curvy stuff, but for the whole building. And so we're seeing a lot more like ubiquitous, repeatable, very large institutional structures kind of taking hold and getting developed around the country, which is, obviously like a positive pattern for the wood industry, but it's important to realize that there's like a long and storied history. It's just kind of getting the attention now. That is a new piece. Right,
definitely. And I mean, these products, it's particularly CLT, I mean, as always, the kind of the flagship, but yeah, it allows us to go beyond a small feature area of the building to, like you mentioned, making the entire building a viable wood structure, which, I mean, a lot of advancements in the building code are letting us get into areas that we've never been able to get into. Like as of 2015, we can go up to 6 stories. 2020 National Building Code of Canada will allow for 12 stories of encapsulated mass timber. So the potential to get into a large market is it's right in front of our faces. And EllisDon being a leader in this area, I think you've got something, over 500,000 square feet of mass timber on the slate under construction right now in Ontario.
Yeah, we've seen quite a bit of, we've seen quite a large growth in like the amount of timber that we're certainly executing on our sites, and that's probably indicative of all of our competition too, right? Like we're not the only ones building timber, everyone is. And I think everyone's portfolios are growing in the timber world. What we've been seeing in the past several years is there's like a really long, non-linear growth in the amount of interest there is in wood. It kind of went from not many people talking about it in 2015 to us, and then kind of a non-linear growth from there on out. Now everyone wants to understand the insights, what's going on, things of that nature. And simultaneously, we've kind of seen a linear growth in the amount of timber projects that actually kind of reach the execution phase. And so it's not like an exponential growth, which is good because the market can't support that type of thing. But we've certainly seen like a linear and significant growth year over year in the amount of timber we're actually deploying out on sites. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, we have quite a bit of on the go today. 3 big projects underway in the Toronto market, a couple others that are wrapping up in the BC market. Happy to kind of show you some photos of those as well, and maybe a couple other cool ones just to show you how the growth is taking place very quickly here. And so, this is kind of the transition zone. So this is a community center. It's fairly large, and we're now seeing this going to timber. This is a community center out on the West Coast. There was also Passive House that was kind of completed a couple of years ago. Relatively large still. Then we got into building the Expo Pavilion for the the World Expo in Dubai, which I think just wrapped up this summer. And then kind of the 3 big jobs that we wanted to highlight, I wanted to kind of mention today. These are all in the GTA. First one being Centennial College, which is a 6-story master building, like humongous endeavor, which is under construction today. This is kind of a live feed from just a little while ago. And what we really want to highlight here is that several years ago, like not that many, even 4 or 5 years ago, this type of development wouldn't have even been viable in the code environment. And now we're seeing multiple of these happening across the country simultaneously. And it's, I think, really important to point out that it is people like the colleges and universities, the institutional sector, that are leading the way. And we can probably talk a little bit more why that is in terms of adoption of kind of a new building methodology. And so again, just a beautiful building. And you can see kind of the marrying of a concrete core and a mass timber structure. And, it makes a lot of sense to use materials where they're most efficient. Just a couple more photos. It's underway. If you drive along the highway out past Scarborough, you can see it clearly from the highway now. It's gotten up kind of above the buildings. Another large building that's underway, the timber is kind of set to arrive shortly, is these commercial office buildings, again in Toronto, called T3 Sterling. It's a Hines project. And, this is humongous. It's a humongous commercial building this time. 6 stories and 8 stories. Again, kind of trailblazing in the Toronto market for what a developer can do, and kind of testing out some new methodologies with the lateral system being a steel brace frame. You can kind of see it in some of these renderings.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So trying out a couple different things. It's a really exciting project. And lastly, another institutional job. This is Humber College Cultural Hub, which has a very mixed programming between, some athletic spaces, some performance spaces, big long span areas, and then a large student residence kind of on top of all of it on a very constrained site. And so, again, they're utilizing timber for the entire student residence and using it where it makes the most sense, and where, blazing the trail into, although they're an institutional client, like kind of helping the industry figure out a lot of the residential applications of these products, which is really exciting. And again, that one's deep into construction now. Timber should arrive kind of early next year. So simultaneously, like, quite a bit of timber coming. It's busy time, but again, this is what we've been ramping up for, like I said, 4, 5, 6 years at this point.
That's great. I think what's really cool about those projects that you highlighted is that, and you mentioned it a couple of times, to use timber where it makes sense, which, we love to see. I think there's so much potential to do those types of projects like Humber College, where you can put some stories on top of, perhaps a concrete base or something similar, to maximize the lightweight nature of the material and applications where it makes sense. Concrete cores, where we had some interesting conversations a couple of weeks ago in Toronto, where some engineers mentioned, like, using a concrete core just often is the best and easiest way to make your building successful. So, I mean, that's something that's great about wood, is that it lends itself to hybrid construction. I think it plays nicely with all the other material. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's a fair statement to make.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the ambition of like the timber community is not necessarily to be purists and like everything has to be timber and we got to use timber dowels and every connection and it's got to be 100% wood. I think that might be like a little bit misguided. I think at least from our perspective at EllisDon, like the intention is to use the materials that helps solve like the client's problems in like the most efficient manner. And so if they have objectives related to aesthetics, objectives related to construction efficiency and costs, and importantly, embodied carbon. I think you don't necessarily have to. There's a balancing act that every building is a hybrid, certainly, and so I think there's a place for hybrids, and certainly every building that we've built to timber to date doesn't stand alone with just timber. There's quite a bit of steel, quite a bit of concrete, and it makes sense to, especially as like design teams and procurement models become like more integrated, makes sense to kind of use these materials where they have their strong suits. So that's what we've been trying to do. At least that's what we've been witnessing the design community try to do. And I think it's where you can reach some optimums. Like, we're never going to probably do a timber basement underground. You're right on the lateral approach. There's some efficiencies you can get, especially when you get into higher buildings with using concrete. And there's also like, kind of political efficiencies. The perception is there from approval agencies that steel and concrete are tried and true in certain applications. And so we certainly want to streamline the application process and not like just introduce friction and make it pure timber for the sake of like purity. We want to kind of come up with systems that are repeatable and we can deploy broadly. That's the goal. I might have lost you there. Did I get you?
I got you. Are you still there?
Okay.
Cool. No, that makes a lot of sense on the approvals process. I mean, we want, especially as people in the timber industry, those efficiencies to be realized. I mean, there's a lot of promises. I mean, we know the aesthetic benefit of timber is, I think, universally agreed upon when you can expose it in the right areas. I think I want to touch on the climate change and sustainability in a minute, but things like efficiencies in speed of construction, repeatability. The T3 project is a great example. I believe there's examples of T3 in Minneapolis, Chicago, Atlanta. I think there's one planned in California and another site going up simultaneously in Toronto. So I think Hines really has shown that you can maximize your efficiency and repeat a building in timber. I think there's maybe too much of that boutique mindset sometimes to have that curvy glulam showcase when it's actually a very efficient material to use in a standard grid that you can put up in any city in North America. Yeah,
no, I totally agree. I think as we mentioned, like the showcase boutique era was it's been going on for quite a while, and those jobs can still happen, but what's getting tagged along with it now is like you're saying, making timber buildings that are rectilinear, ubiquitous, and efficient. And I think the Hines model that they've kind of crafted and duplicated around North America is like a testament to the fact that you can compete financially. They're a private sector company. They're buying land, they're building buildings. Like they have a viable business model in place to utilize timber and build beautiful, efficient buildings at the same time in a variety of markets. I guess it remains to be seen. Like they certainly have a great model. They certainly execute very efficiently, and it remains to be seen like how many other developers can kind of follow that trail.
Right.
In the same market. I think it's a great move, and I think it's smart to be a lot of times if they're the first movers in the market, and maybe there's some benefits that they reap from having these beautiful buildings come up and hit the leasing market before generally anyone else. And so, but I think it takes kind of confident leadership, like they've certainly shown, to help push the market. I think, there's some other private sector developers that take more of a stance where they just kind of wait and see. They're maybe a little bit more risk averse, or maybe have some other constraints in mind, but there's not a whole lot of precedent out there for timber commercial office buildings, and certainly it's a safe decision probably for a lot of people to do the same thing that their developing company's been doing for many years, whether it's steel or concrete or whatever the market is supporting right now. And so it takes some confident leadership to kind of, and probably introduce a bit of friction into their own life to kind of take on something new. And so it's great that Hines is kind of blazing a trail for hopefully many other developers to follow. Once you have some built examples in a variety of markets and they're performing well, and they seem stable on the performance, I think that's a huge boon for the industry.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, EllisDon, I think, is forging a similar path, having jumped into this market, like you said, half a dozen years ago, when very few companies on the actual building side have taken that leap. So I mean, aside from aesthetic benefits, obviously, as you mentioned, there's a learning curve. I know you've walked me through a couple of the efficiency studies, which maybe I'll get you to touch on that crane analysis, because I think that's a very interesting point, that just to show how detailed EllisDon is getting into it. But I would imagine that would be at a bit of a financial cost for the company. I'm sure you could keep churning out steel and concrete massive buildings throughout Canada, North America operations. So what, aside from aesthetic benefits, does it mean to yourself, and does it mean to EllisDon to jump into timber construction? Is there a focus on sustainability? Is it just an interest in the material?
Yeah, it's a good point. And this is kind of goes back to that group that I lead, that takes on kind of tasks like this, the construction scientist team. It's rare to come across. Whenever I say, oh, I work in construction sciences, like no one has a clue what that means, because it's so rare. And there's not too many other companies out there. There's a few, but not too many other companies that have a team separate from the operations that takes on kind of thinking like this. And so, I think it speaks to the executives and the vision of the people at the top of EllisDon to understand that construction is a very technical field, and there's a need, and certainly a growing need from our clients to help them advise on new technologies, and really couple whatever the sales pitch is with some grounded practical insights into the viability of it. And so when the timber code started to change, we knew that clients are they're going to come and start knocking on our door for answers. And so honestly, I think the initial push into timber was mainly to be responsive and to help serve our client base effectively, and it kind of grew from there. And now it's definitely linked into a whole number of facets. We have various R&D initiatives going to not only learn about the industry, but to push it forward, to try to accelerate it. And that's driven by we have a corporate sustainability plan. I think EllisDon, as a big influential company, has a role to play in trying to lead the industry and trying to push the boundaries of it on the carbon front. And hopefully we have some volume behind us to actually kind of steer the ship, and hopefully others can follow. And so there's a sense of responsibility now in place to because the jobs are getting so much larger, and the numbers are certainly growing. We're just trying to mitigate risk as effectively as possible, and push forward on the innovation front to address things like labor shortages and things like that, as well as push forward to help us understand like the carbon implications of our own business. Like we're humble enough to like understand that we're a big part of like the carbon problem, just being a construction company. And so want to figure out if timber is a way to address that. And we should say like we're not like timber freaks either. We have experts in concrete, we have experts in steel, experts in glass and glazing, and we're endeavoring to kind of figure out. Are you still there, Tim? Sorry.
Yeah, still got you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my computer just totally shut down, but it's all back now.
Right.
We can leave that part in.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyways, yeah, we're just trying to lead the industry on all fronts, and I think you guys certainly see the timber focus, but we're pushing forward to try to find solutions to cement and carbon, things like that, all over the place. It's just a bit of a it's a kind of a shotgun approach, and being a corporate, we have the ability to kind of tap into a lot of projects and access a lot of good information.
No, that's great. And I mean, it's so much in the conversation now to have carbon plans and address, like you mentioned earlier, embodied carbon, which was largely something that wasn't really in anybody's mindset until recently. We heard all kinds of talk about operational carbon over the years and net zero buildings, which you can produce in steel, concrete, and hybrid materials, with some thoughtful design. But that embodied carbon is now really in the conversation, because I don't really know if everybody realizes just how much energy it takes to produce concrete and steel when you compare it to wood, which actually sequesters carbon in the material, which would otherwise decay, which is a fact that even shocked me a couple of years back, is that many forests in Ontario are actually a carbon source, because when trees die through natural means, they decay and release their carbon back into the atmosphere. But when you convert that wood into a building material, it'll store it indefinitely for the life of the building, which is just a very interesting fact that I don't think we talk about enough in the industry. So I mean, at a certain point, we have to address that climate change issue, or else it's just all for nothing, so to speak.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, it's certainly like taken front and center stage for us recently, and it's I mean, I think it's kind of the fight of our generation, is to kind of figure out and address the carbon issues with the operation of our buildings, with the materials themselves, both of them very hard challenges. And sometimes I look at COVID as like an interesting case study, because there's a lot of things in place that we thought were impossible to change, and then a pandemic happens, and kind of institutions within an afternoon kind of turned on a dime. And I think while some of that was very disruptive, some of them were like tremendous wins. And I think what that kind of shows us is that things can change, and they can change not over the course of 25, 30 years. They can actually change a lot faster than maybe we all initially thought. And so that's encouraging. And I think the construction industry has a tendency to change quite slowly, and but maybe with kind of the renewed interest and the political will, those changes can actually be accelerated quite a bit. And so the work that institutions are doing, leading the way and building buildings, and the private sector is certainly following suit, all goes to kind of build this momentum, which will help inform policies and decision making, like policies at like a regulatory level, which then kind of trickles down to decision making of our clients, which I think is the feedback loop that we need to kind of inspire more focus on carbon and more use of kind of low carbon materials in our building environment.
We're seeing a lot of countries undertake actual government mandates in terms of construction. We see France is asking for, I believe, 50% timber content in public buildings. Netherlands has similar policy, and it's a real highlight in the UK's new climate action plan on the building side. Do you think that we're in a place in Canada or North America where that's something that needs to be mandated, or should it be up to us in part of the construction industry to undertake that without, for lack of a better word, being forced to do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's important to recognize that timber is certainly part of a climate solution, which is very positive. And steel and concrete also need to be part of that climate solution. We have to kind of find better ways to do all of it. As we talked a little bit about before, all these buildings have everything in it, and if the goal is to actually strive for zero, CO2 emissions, like in the future, I think everything has to get figured out. And so, mandating timber is one way that certain jurisdictions around have had some success in tweaking the carbon footprint of their built environment. But I think it's important, and maybe more the role of regulators, to mandate the outcomes that they want, and not necessarily the products, because it spurs like a ton of innovation across many disciplines, and probably even areas that we're not even thinking about. But I think it's, while timber is important to put in buildings for its carbon benefits, it's also important to really find ways to do concrete and steel better. And so by maybe mandating more of an outcome or performance based rather than like specifics could be one route to achieving that, and still kind of helping out the timber industry. I think there's probably like a supply conversation that kind of happens in parallel with that regulatory conversation, in understanding like how much timber, extra timber, can the industry support if everyone has to build half their building with it, or whatever the policy is. Is that achievable, or do we need to kind of phase that, or have multiple industries kind of chip in? It's certainly a complicated, really nuanced thing, but it's probably the case where like some action is better than no action, and some action, and then kind of adjusting as we kind of see things unfolding is the correct approach, instead of doing nothing until it's fully settled. I think the time lag is associated with kind of the climate challenge ahead, or such that you kind of like, the best bang for your buck is to do stuff now, right? So yeah, I think that's important to recognize in that whole kind of regulatory discussion too.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of brings up an interesting thought too that we kind of like to discuss. We talked about this before about, you in EllisDon having exposure to, the whole market, get to work with the public sector and the private sector. And there's a very big difference depending on who your client is. I think you've kind of mentioned to me before that the public sector sell on a timber option isn't as hard as the private sector option. I mean, they're in the private sector often just, show me the cost number, and that's all I care about. So what is that disconnect in the building industry compared to maybe some other industries where people will maybe pay a slight premium or deal with some difficult steps to achieve different goals that you don't see in the private sector? Like, why is cost such a leader when it comes to private sector development?
Yeah, certainly. I think we probably have to get a developer in here, and they'll tell you like the straight goods. We're kind of a little bit one step removed from their actual decision making, but I can kind of weigh in on what we're seeing and what we're feeling. I mean, you're right. Our experience has certainly been that the institutional sector, the colleges, the universities, have led the way in terms of adoption of timber across Canada. And they have different incentive structures within their organizations. They have, the final cost of the building is certainly important, but their objectives are a little bit differently aligned. They need to attract like talented students. They need to attract funding. They need to attract good professors, and having a unique institutional building is like one way of doing that. And so whether they pay for like a beautiful architecture using conventional materials, or they pay for mass timber. I think it's becoming more important for institutions to have like a visible display of sustainability. We kind of went through a phase where everyone's putting solar panels on everything. Yeah. And that was their visible display of like, we care about this. This is an institution that cares about these global problems. Now timber is one of those offerings where, in addition to doing the sustainability and the more invisible things behind the scenes with HVAC systems, it's nice to have something that's very visible and the public can see and talk about and question. I think that's why the institutional sector is right in there first, and kind of all there's dozens of institutions kind of jockeying in position to have like the coolest or the newest or the flashiest kind of a timber building on their campuses.
Right.
So the private sector world has a significantly different set of decision-making kind of variables that they're weighing with. And I think it boils down to like, it has to be a good business. Like it has to be a good business decision for them. And so we see the construction costs only, and we see kind of what goes into it compared to, say, a timber or concrete building. I think, again, these are all moving targets, and they've changed. If I had this talk with you 5 years ago, it would be very different than what I'm saying now, which is, we're approaching cost neutrality with conventional materials in some of the competitive markets in Toronto, Vancouver, maybe Montreal. We don't do too much work there. And so, even though today we're still seeing a bit of a premium out there, we're just seeing the construction costs. And so what I think is important is to zoom out kind of one level from the construction, and developers can certainly weigh in on if timber changes the rest of the picture for them at all. Right. Whether the building having this unique timber feature helps it lease up, the market uptake might be faster. There could be like a market setting lease rate if you're offering something different. You might be able to attract a different type of tenant that you wouldn't otherwise been able to get. There's some considerations like that we're by no means experts in, but we hear anecdotally through our client group that those decisions and some of those decisions are kind of helping inform like the broader decision making process, which actually, although maybe there's a premium on the construction, when you fast forward 20 years, like the real decision is like, what is going to be the best outcome for the lifetime of this building? And if you can make little tweaks to the lease rate, things like that, it actually the lifetime of the building best decision increasingly we're hoping is becoming timber. And there's people leading the way on that today. That's how you get widespread adoption. It kind of just has to make sense economically for our clients. And I think it's a very competitive business, and they're all incentivized to kind of play within the rule book that is in front of them. And that's obviously the building code and the regulations that different jurisdictions have on them. And so it's a bit of a level playing field, and everyone's trying to make a business case for certain pieces of property and things like that. And so two things are happening. The rule book is slowly changing. As you mentioned, the codes are evolving, which maybe allow a bit more tolerance in terms of using timber, which just reduce the cost a little bit. The costs of timber are also changing as the supply chain matures, and new suppliers come online. It's getting more understood, more competitive. The other trades involved in this ecosystem, the M&E people, the finishing people, the trades on site, they're understanding it more. So there's less like fear pricing going on. And lastly, conventional building materials are getting more expensive. There's labor scarcity, there's material volatility across all sectors just due to supply chain things. And so all these kind of forces are actually like pushing forward and for the most part are helping timber become more viable as opposed to less viable. And so, these are kind of, we're talking at a certain point in time, but if we fast forward a couple of years, we're actually expecting that they'll just become more competitive to a point where it's kind of just a cost neutral decision.
Yeah, which is great. And I mean, I think people are even maturing in the clientele on how to do this properly. We saw it in our line of work so often that say, well, what's the timber option for this building? Well, sometimes there isn't one. You know, when you want to think timber, you should think timber from day one. You know, it shouldn't be a convert, it should be your first thought. And as we talk to more and more clients, and I'm sure you see the same thing, if you go in and you talk to someone like yourself at EllisDon who, you know, knows what they're doing, it makes a big difference. Some roadblocks that we've seen in the regulatory area, like fire services, well, it's oftentimes people who are unfamiliar with timber buildings at all. In the insurance industry, sometimes it's brokers that are unfamiliar with the timber industry completely. But now I think clients are realizing that if they shop around, get an experienced team together, is how you really maximize your efficiency, as opposed to, you know, kind of going with your same design and erection team that puts up all your steel buildings. Well, yeah, of course they're not experienced in putting up a timber building because they've never done it before, but there's more and more people out there now who have done it and done it well and can help you realize all of that, you know, kind of magical checklist that we advertise when we talk about timber buildings, which is all true if you have the right people in place.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, it goes with like all materials. Like you just have to get people on the team that know what they're doing and are willing to work together on it. And you know, it's the same with, I guess, there just happens to be more people that know about that in the concrete and steel world. There's quite a bit of inertia in the industry on those fronts, and you know, the education has a place to be, like a role to play in all of this as well. You know, I went to engineering school, good engineering school, and in Canada, and we spent like 3 years learning about steel and concrete, and maybe a week and a half learning like about wood frame construction. And so like these are the schools that are like teaching the next generation of all of us. The you know, the developers often come from these types of schools, like the insurance people, you know, certainly the construction people, and obviously the designers. And so, you know, having like a more weighted focus on, you know, as this becomes more viable and more widespread, and for it to become more widespread, you kind of need more people to get into it at the early stage. And, you know, and that's like the education stage, so that, you know, as they kind of trickle up into these kind of positions of decision making, they actually know what it is. And then it's not a surprise. It's not coming as a surprise, because, you know, they've been learning about it for years. They've been seeing it all around. It's just kind of one extra piece of the puzzle, is this kind of education piece that I think is important to stress, you know, because not every company has a luxury. Actually, almost no one has the luxury of spending 5 years learning about something before you do it. You know, and so it's easy to make a decision to do something that's safe in these kind of maybe risk averse kind of corporations. And so having like a broad understanding of timber and having a ton of built examples out there is just one additional route to you know, mitigating the risk, which helps on the insurance front, which helps on the other trades fronts. It helps across the board.
Yeah, and it's great. I think that we're starting to see all that happen, like you mentioned, you know, that education stuff, which is such an eye-opener to realize that, you know, you don't even learn it in school. And we hear, you know, there's still that kind of buzz around a mass timber option that, oh, they chose timber instead of traditional construction, which is always referring to concrete and steel, even though, you know, we've been building with wood and multi-story, like you mentioned, for 100+ years, and then thousands of years before that in most of our buildings, until the advent of concrete and steel. So, you know, for us, having been in the game for a number of years, we see the inching towards that more mainstream. But in your opinion, having been exposed to so many different clients and building materials, where does mass timber and even timber construction in general fit in right now? Is it still in its infancy? Is it starting to get its legs, and we're going to see that explosion sooner than later? Does it still have a lot of work behind it at this stage?
Yeah, it is interesting, and I don't pretend to like know the future. It's hard to know where things are going. Especially further out. I think, just from our perspective, I can tell you what we're seeing, and again, I think it's like I wouldn't expect like an explosion, because I think like an explosion necessitates some like exponential growth on all fronts, and all these timber elements, they're fabricated components, and there's like a fixed supply out there in the world, and so it could explode in some areas, and we certainly see like hot spots where a lot of people are doing it, but it's hard to envision like a widespread, everyone all of a sudden is like timber is the thing they're doing, because I think that would probably just drive up prices and actually just kind of quench that very quickly because of the limitations on supply. So I think what we are more likely to see is kind of like just like a limited, not limited, linear kind of like sustained growth, over the next like kind of probably the long term, hopefully. Assuming that sustainable forestry is still something that's like well understood and well regulated within North America and Europe. We have there's interest in the supply communities for expansion and growing capacity. Like I think that the demand of the market is kind of getting matched by the capacity of the suppliers at this moment. And I think we'll just kind of see that, in the grand scheme of like the construction industry, I think timber currently sits, as like a pretty small place in the large scale construction world. Obviously, every home in like the country is made of wood, yeah. But in terms of the big institutional 100,000 square foot office building, the 4 to 10 story world, like I think timber has a larger role to play there. It's probably now in like the single digit percentage range, probably below 5. I actually don't know the numbers on. You probably know better than me.
I would say that you pretty much nailed it. What is it? One in 100 buildings probably in that sector really considered.
Yeah. And so like that's today, like I think the timber should strive to like make the fundamentals of it such that it can be considered on every job, and it can be a viable alternative on many more of them. I think what we're seeing now is like there's quite a few first movers, people who are gaining advantage in the market because they're moving first and because they're just ambitious. So they have a sustainability objective, and which is great. We need those people. They lead the market, but I think it's hard to believe that like the widespread development market will like kind of make like the altruistic decision, and which maybe is not the best financial decision. So I think, as we talked about before, there's a bunch of forces helping out timber right now on the regulation front, the cost front, and once they're all kind of trending together, and every step of the way, more and more people are getting interested. But I would assume it's kind of more of a linear growth. And I think the institutional sector only has like so much they can build. There's only so many projects that happen, and they've led the way. But I think what we want to start seeing is the private sector kind of getting involved and dipping their toes in further, and they already are. But I think it's going to happen more widespread.
No, that's great. And I mean, we appreciate companies like EllisDon leading the way here. As we mentioned, it's at a cost of time and a financial cost, but when you believe in it and take it forward like EllisDon does, I mean, you're doing your own education and research as a company that can benefit the industry as a whole, which is outstanding to see from private companies. So the Wood Council appreciates it. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Maybe I'll just like maybe I'll just mention a couple of cool things that we're actually doing that you could probably look to see from us in the next year or so. I mentioned like we're an R&D team. In addition to helping out all our sites, we do some R&D on the side, and we're undertaking like a a couple of really exciting and really large R&D projects right now in the timber world. One of them being a hybrid panelized system. So we're trying to find ways to use timber in applications that it kind of doesn't make sense right now. Like if an office developer wants like a big tower with 40-foot clear spans, you can certainly do that at timber, but it's like not going to make sense.
Right.
The beams are going to be huge. And so we're looking at some hybrid approaches, combining timber with some other things. In our plant, we have a factory not too far from Toronto, where we're going to do some prototypes in the next year and see if we can come up with some interesting things. And we're also working on a unique modular approach, and that's all I'll say about that.
Right on. That's great.
Yeah, and that one's more geared towards the residential world. So we kind of have a commercial thing going on and a residential thing, to kind of just help the timber industry kind of get more penetration into some markets that that currently, you know, are kind of waiting and seeing what's going to happen.
Right on. Well, once again, Mark, we thank you for your time, and thanks to EllisDon again for leading the way. We have Mark Gaglione with EllisDon in the Construction Sciences Department. And if you want to get a hold of Mark, let us know, and I'm sure there's always some good conversations to be had about wood construction.
Yeah,
thanks for your time. Right on.
Yeah.
Take care.
Appreciate it, Tim. Thanks.